Okay, the animal kingdom is another kingdom that we are going to survey some organisms. The animals they're going to range in things from the things that you recognize as living organisms, such as cats, maybe dogs, horses, even things as small as little roly-polies, things that you can see kind of crossing the little asphalt periodically. Worms are animals. The largest group of animals that we're going to see would be that of the insects. Then many of the animals that you don't see on a daily basis because they are going to be aquatic, and then they're going to live in the ocean. So what we're going to see is that the animals that are living on land have adapted different ways of obtaining nutrients and reproducing than the animals that live in aquatic environments. So some of the things we're going to look at is how these organisms have adapted, but we're also going to keep in line this whole scheme of evolutionary links amongst these organisms. So characteristics that all animals will have, they're all going to be heterotrophic, meaning that they're going to get their carbon source from organic matter. And the organic matter would be things such as proteins, lipids, carbohydrates. And they're going to get their food by ingestion. Some of the things that in which they're going to ingest, we're going to see the different adaptive abilities, such as filter feeding, or the idea of suspension feeding, or as bulk feeding. Bulk feeding would be something that you might have seen a video in terms of a python engulfing a large antelope, or a huge animal twice as big as the size of its whole mouth, because they're able to adapt in terms of their jaws dislodging, and that python can then swallow that whole organism. So filter feeding, suspension feeding, bulk feeding are all different ways that heterotrophs are going to be able to obtain nutrients. The means of locomotion. Now we're going to look at things that muscles, specialized tissues that will allow organisms to move. Granted, the cilia and flagella are mechanisms of movements. Now we're going to look at a very specialized tissue type that is specific for the process of locomotion. And the locomotion, these muscles are going to be attached usually to a skeleton, whether it's an exoskeleton or whether it's going to be an endoskeleton. The idea of the muscles being attached to the skeletal system will allow for specialized movements in many different cases. We're really not going to see these endo and exoskeletons really until we get to the phylum Arthropoda and the insects. Otherwise, pretty much the muscles are going to be either in a circular or longitudinal ring, such as the roundworms, or in other words, no roundworms, but also the Annelida, the earthworms. So we're going to see how muscles play a role in terms of specialization. The other thing that we're going to see is in terms of cell specialization. A group of cells that they work together for a specialized function, we're going to see different tissues arise. And these tissues are going to arise from the germ layers. Tissues could be muscle tissue, nerve tissue, epithelial tissue, I'm not sure about the spelling. But these specialized tissues are going to allow for a high degree of really complex interaction amongst cells that they also have to evolve in terms of how to communicate. Then lastly, we're also going to see that all these trends among animals is basically they're going to mean sexual reproduction. That means they are going to form gametes by this process of meiosis. And in meiosis is a way in which the chromosomes are halved in terms of their numbers, and also variation is going to increase. So that when these egg and sperm gametes join together, what happens, they form a new organism that now has variation. So sexual reproduction in animals is a key in which variation will occur in order to adapt to different environments. Some of the trends that we're going to see, some of the key notes. Okay, this formation of the germ layers. Note here, no germ layers, no true tissues here. We get these organisms called sponges. Once we get into these true germ layers, and there are 3 of them, they're later on in the actual podcast here, these 3 germ layers are going to distinguish between a true animal and, or in other words, a colonial animal and a true animal. Then we're going to get the type of symmetry, either bilateral symmetry are radial symmetry. Another key point would be a type of body cavity or no body cavity. A body cavity we can consider a space or an opening to hold specialized tissues or specialized organs. For example, in our abdominal cavity, we have our liver, our large and small intestines, our stomach. Then we're also going to see in terms of more specialization in terms of how the organism develops its intestines. It's called a gut. Either you're going to be considered a deuterosome or a protosome. And then the process of segmentation and where these are, how this is going to allow for specialized organs like antennae are a specialized segmented part of the insect body. Or, for example, your muscles, your skeletal muscles, and how they are grouped into different biceps and triceps, how they are organized and segmented into specialized ways of locomotion. So those are some of the key events in terms of the evolutionary organization of animals. The germ layers, there are 3 germ layers: endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm. Right here, these little red things are going to be the mesoderm here. And they form eventually the different tissues of an animal. Like an ectoderm is going to help form some of the nerve tissue. The endoderm is going to form much of the gut. Mesoderm is going to form much of the muscle tissue. So what happens is that these germ layers, they're going to be the primary cells that are then going to differentiate and give rise to the tissues of animals. Fate of the blastula. Fate of the blastula is simply a difference in way in which the formation from gastrula to blastula, these are different stages of embryonic development. And it's this blastopore here that is going to either give rise to either the mouth or the anus, because our digestive tract, in theory, or in terms of science, is literally a tube within a larger tube. So if we go from mouth all the way to anus, that's where your food process is going to go through. You're going to be considered a deuterosome. If, for example, the blastopore becomes the anus initially, that is going to be a deuterosome. If it becomes essentially the mouth, that's going to be a protosome. So this is literally a form of classification in terms of the fate of the blastopore. The body cavity, or in other words, openings. If, for example, the body cavity, like in this case here, you have a body cavity here, but it's not completely lined with muscle tissue. You notice the difference between here, a true coelomate, you're going to have this muscle tissue that aligns the body cavity. Whereas in here you got a body cavity that's simply aligned only on one side. That's going to be a pseudocoelom. And then you're going to have organisms in which there is no body cavity, and those are going to be acoelomates. So it's essentially the body cavity opening in order to store various organs. Say, for example, here an acoelomate, a classic flatworm. It's a little photograph that I shot. It's very flat. These organisms, they are like maybe 1 to 2 millimeters thick. They're not going to grow large. They are not going to have specialized organs inside their cavity because they have no cavity. And in order for them to continue to move and digest their food, they have to constrict these muscles. Whereas you can eat your food and you don't have to really worry about passing the food through via peristalsis because your body cavity is going to be lined with muscles and your intestines are going to be lined with muscles to do that job. Here's a cross-section of a coelomate such as yourself. We have a cranial cavity, holds our brain. It's an opening, it's highly protected by our skull. We have a thoracic cavity which is going to hold our heart and lungs. We also have an abdominal cavity which is going to hold our liver and our intestines, and our pelvic cavity which is going to hold essentially our reproductive organs. So coelomates have 4 distinct cavities which allow for the specialization of these organs to be housed in a specialized compartment and also protected. The other thing that we're going to look at is symmetry. There are 2 main types of symmetry, radial symmetry and bilateral symmetry. Radial symmetry you'll sometimes read as the pentameric. So in other words, here you got a sea star, and from the sea star you're going to have 5 arms that radiate from this central disk. That would be a classic indication of what is considered to be a radial symmetry. Down here we have two. We have a bilateral symmetry. Here's a little moss-headed warbonnet. You can see in terms of bilateral symmetry, I can dissect this animal completely in half and get mirror images of itself. Versus right next to it is a cup coral. Again, we have that radiating factor from a central disk. So these are two examples of symmetry. Organisms such as the sponges, they don't have symmetry, so that's considered to be asymmetrical. But here's a classic in terms of the bilateral symmetry, in which you literally have two distinct mirror images. The other thing about bilateral symmetry is we're going to have parts to it. We're going to have an organism which has the top part, which is dorsal. We're going to have the bottom part, which is ventral. And then we're going to have a tail region, which is going to be posterior. And then we're going to have a head region, which is going to be anterior. So bilateral organisms have 4 distinct regions: dorsal, ventral, posterior, and anterior. However, when we look at, for example, a radial symmetry, you're going to have aboral and oral. This is going to be the aboral because the side in which the mouth is not on, and underneath it will be the oral side, and that's where the mouth of the organism is housed. So those are just terms to kind of orient yourself with respect to the symmetry of an animal. Segmentation, as I noted, is going to be another big thing. So, for example, here we got this lobster. It has various specialized segmented parts. Sorry about that. Segmented parts, and the segmented parts are going to allow for specialized compartmentalization. The other thing we realize is that there's going to be some repetition of body parts. So the main thing to look at here, you'll see it in your terms of your dissection, although we have true coelomates, not all true coelomates are going to be segmented, but then some true coelomates will indeed be segmented. And so when we have the segmentation, we get specialized body parts: arms, legs, our antennae, different specialized walking components. So those are the advantages in terms of the evolutionary trend of segmentation and specialization of body parts.